Napoleon Bonaparte, by the dawn of 1812, stood at the pinnacle of his power, ruling an empire that stretched across much of continental Europe and enforcing his will upon monarchs, ministers, and nations alike. But behind this glittering facade of dominance lay the seeds of overreach, ambition, and geopolitical friction that would soon drag him into one of the most disastrous military campaigns in history, the invasion of Russia. The origins of this monumental conflict can be traced back to Napoleon's rise to power during the French Revolution. His meteoric series of victories across Italy, Austria, Prussia, and Spain, and his relentless drive to shape Europe under the so-called Continental System, a vast economic blockade designed to cripple Britain by forbidding European nations under French control or influence from trading with the island kingdom. This policy, born from Napoleon's frustration at Britain as stubborn resistance, and naval supremacy after the crushing defeat at Trafalgar in 1805, was intended to wage economic war or direct invasion had failed. However, enforcing such a blockade across a patchwork of reluctant allies and vassal states proved almost impossible, and nowhere was resistance to the system more dangerous to Napoleon's strategic vision than in Russia. Tsar Alexander I had initially been Napoleon's ally. Their famous meeting on a raft in the Niemen River in 1807, after the treaties of Tilsit, symbolized a new Franco-Russian partnership, with both leaders professing admiration for each other's abilities. For a time, this alliance seemed mutually beneficial. Napoleon gained recognition of his dominance in Western Europe, while Alexander secured French support for Russian influence in Finland and the Balkans. But as years passed, tensions grew. Russia's economy suffered under the Continental System, which cut off lucrative trade with Britain, while Napoleon's meddling in Eastern European affairs, especially in Poland, stirred Russian suspicion. The Duchy of Warsaw, carved out of Polish lands seized from Prussia, became a flashpoint. Napoleon presented it as a resurrected Polish state, something that deeply alarmed Russia, whose rulers feared the revival of Polish nationalism on their doorstep. By 1810, cracks in the Franco-Russian alliance had widened into chasms. Alexander, frustrated by the economic damage of the blockade, began quietly relaxing enforcement of the Continental System, allowing British goods to enter through neutral ships and smuggling routes, undermining Napoleon's strategy. Napoleon, in turn, responded with economic reprisals, annexing territories such as the Hanseatic ports in northern Germany to seal off trade routes, further alienating the Tsar. Diplomatic relations soured as mutual suspicion deepened. Napoleon's marriage in 1810 to Archduchess Marie-Louise of Austria, sealing an alliance with Russia's old rival, sent an unmistakable signal to St. Petersburg that France was hedging its alliances. Meanwhile, Napoleon's armies were still entangled in the grinding guerrilla war in Spain, known as the Peninsular War, which bled French manpower and resources, a warning sign to cautious advisors that opening another front could be dangerous. But Napoleon's pride, his belief in his own invincibility, and his desire to bring Russia to heel pushed him toward a decision that would test his empire to its limits. The diplomatic breakdown in 1811 and early 1812 was almost inevitable. Correspondence between the two emperors grew colder, more formal, and more accusatory. Alexander expanded his army, reorganized his forces, and prepared for the possibility of war. Napoleon, convinced that only a decisive show of force could restore the Continental System and preserve his dominance, began assembling one of the largest military forces Europe had ever seen. The so-called Grande Armée was not merely French. It was a multinational force drawn from across Napoleon's empire and satellite states. French veterans, Polish regiments eager to strike at Russia, Italians, Germans from the Confederation of the Rhine, Dutch, Swiss, Croat, Spaniards, and others pressed into service. In total, by the summer of 1812, Napoleon would command over 600,000 men, an astonishing logistical undertaking requiring immense quantities of supplies, horses, weapons, and food. This army was the embodiment of Napoleon's imperial reach, yet its diversity also concealed fault lines, linguistic barriers, differing loyalties, and varying levels of training and discipline. Nonetheless, Napoleon believed sheer numbers and his unmatched strategic genius would crush Russian resistance quickly, perhaps in a single decisive battle. Logistics, however, were already emerging as a critical challenge before the campaign even began. The vast distances of Eastern Europe, the primitive state of roads, and the scarcity of local supplies meant the army would have to carry enormous quantities of provisions, a feat almost impossible to sustain over long distances. Napoleon's marshals, many of them experienced and pragmatic, voiced concerns about marching so far into Russia's interior, especially given the lessons of Charles XII of Sweden, who had met disaster in a similar venture a century earlier. But Napoleon dismissed such comparisons, confident that his modern, disciplined army and his own leadership would avoid the pitfalls that had destroyed past invaders. His plan was to move swiftly, forcing the Russians into battle near the border, defeat them decisively, and compel Alexander to negotiate. What Napoleon failed to fully appreciate was that the Russians had no intention of playing by his rules. Under the leadership of generals like Barclay de Tolly and later Mikhail Kutuzov, the Russian strategy would hinge on trading space for time, retreating deeper into their own vast territory, drawing Napoleon further from his supply bases and relying on the brutal Russian climate to sap the invaders' strength. By the spring of 1812, the atmosphere in Europe was electric with anticipation. French propaganda portrayed the coming campaign as a righteous endeavor to uphold the continental system and punish Russian treachery. Russian rhetoric framed it as a patriotic struggle against a foreign tyrant seeking to dominate all Europe. Ordinary people across the continent, from Paris to Warsaw to Moscow, braced for a clash of titans. Napoleon meticulously reviewed maps, gathered intelligence, and coordinated the movement of hundreds of thousands of troops toward assembly points along the Niemen River, the border between the Duchy of Warsaw and the Russian Empire. This massive buildup was a logistical ballet on a continental scale, involving depots of food, ammunition, and fodder for the countless horses. Yet even before crossing the frontier, the strain was apparent, with shortages, disease, and desertion already thinning the ranks. Still, in June 1812, Napoleon stood at the head of his colossal force, convinced that destiny favored him. On June 24th, as the sun rose over the Niemen, the Grande Armée began to cross into Russian territory, the opening act of a campaign that would soon spiral far beyond even Napoleon's formidable capacity for control. Yet in this moment of apparent strength, the seeds of disaster were sown. The political motives that had driven Napoleon to this decision were entangled with personal pride and a dangerous underestimation of both his opponent and the environment he was marching into. Russia's sheer size, its unpredictable climate, and the resolve of its people would prove far more formidable than Napoleon's calculations allowed. The invasion, which he expected to be swift and decisive, would instead stretch into a grinding war of attrition. What began with the thunder of drums and the glitter of bayonets crossing the Niemen would end months later in a shattered remnant of an army, staggering back across the same river in the dead of winter. But in June 1812, none of that was yet visible on the horizon. All that could be seen was the grandeur of the moment. Napoleon, astride his horse, watching regiment after regiment file into the misty morning toward a fate that would redefine the course of European history and mark the beginning of the end for his empire. The crossing of the Niemen River in late June 1812 marked the dramatic beginning of Napoleon's grand gamble, an operation of such unprecedented scale that even his enemies marveled at the logistical genius required to bring it into motion. Yet from the very first days, the campaign began to deviate from the emperor's meticulously crafted vision. The Grande Armée, swollen to over 600,000 men with tens of thousands of cavalry horses, artillery pieces, and endless baggage wagons, began its slow advance into Russian territory, expecting to meet the Tsar's armies head-on near the border, where a swift and decisive victory could be won. But the Russians, under the cautious and calculating leadership of General Barclay de Tolly, had other plans entirely. Instead of defending the frontier, Barclay, supported by Prince Bagration, in command of the southern wing, implemented a strategy of deliberate withdrawal, refusing battle and steadily falling back deeper into the Russian interior. This was a tactic that infuriated many Russian officers and soldiers, who saw retreat as dishonorable. But Alexander I understood, and Barclay insisted, that to confront Napoleon's concentrated might at the outset would be to risk annihilation. The vastness of Russia was their true weapon, and they intended to use it, drawing Napoleon ever further from his supply lines, while scorching the earth behind them to deny the invaders food, forage, and shelter. Napoleon, accustomed to enemies who sought decisive engagements, found this tactic maddening. Each day's march brought dusty roads, oppressive summer heat, and a landscape increasingly stripped bare by retreating Russian forces, who burned villages, destroyed crops, and drove away livestock to leave nothing for the French to seize. In the early weeks, the physical toll on the Grande Armée became evident. Water sources were scarce and often fouled. Food supplies dwindled faster than anticipated, and thousands of soldiers fell ill with dysentery, heatstroke, and exhaustion before they had even fired a shot in anger. Horses, the lifeblood of cavalry and transport, perished in alarming numbers from overwork and lack of fodder, leaving artillery and supply wagons stranded or slowed to a crawl. Napoleon pressed on, convinced that sooner or later the Russians would be forced to stand and fight. His operational plan aimed to split Barclay's First Army and Bagration's Second Army before they could unite, striking each in turn with overwhelming force. To achieve this, he dispatched Marshal Davout's corps toward Minsk to intercept Bagration, while sending other forces in a broad enveloping maneuver to pin down Barclay. But the Russians, aided by superior local knowledge and the flexibility afforded by their scorched earth withdrawals, managed to evade these traps. At every turn, Napoleon found that the enemy had slipped away, often by mere hours, leaving behind smoking ruins and empty fields. This endless chase began to erode the morale of his men. The promise of a swift and glorious victory was replaced by the monotony of forced marshes under blistering heat, swarms of insects, and the grim realization that the countryside offered little sustenance. Disease and desertion claimed tens of thousands in the opening month alone, losses almost invisible on the vast muster rolls but deeply felt by individual regiments whose numbers dwindled daily. By mid-July, the Grande Armée had advanced hundreds of kilometers into Russian territory, yet no decisive battle had been fought. Napoleon's frustration grew, but so did his determination. He interpreted the Russian withdrawals not as a deliberate strategy, but as evidence of weakness, a sign that his enemies feared to face him. He believed that if he could push them just a bit further, they would be cornered into defending key cities or supply depots. Smolensk, an ancient fortress city on the Niemen River, emerged as such a target, a strategic gateway to Moscow and a vital communications hub for the Russian armies. Napoleon hoped that, by threatening Smolensk, he could finally force Barclay and Bagration to unite and fight on ground of his choosing. Meanwhile, the Russian retreat was causing political tension in St. Petersburg, where Alexander I faced criticism from nobles, generals, and the public for allowing the French to penetrate so deeply without offering battle. This pressure would soon influence the pace and nature of Russian decisions. As the Grande Armée approached the Dnieper, the scale of its logistical difficulties became even more apparent. Supply lines stretching back to Poland were overextended, vulnerable to harassment by Cossack raiders and local militias. Food shortages grew acute. Soldiers resorted to slaughtering horses for meat, stripping bark from trees, and raiding what little could be found in the abandoned villages. Discipline began to fray, with marauding parties sometimes wandering miles from the marching columns, only to be cut down by swift-moving Russian cavalry patrols. Napoleon, ever the master of discipline and order, tried to enforce control, but the realities of a campaign in such a vast and barren land undermined even his authority. Letters from the front to Paris painted an optimistic picture, assuring the Empress Marie-Louise and the French public that victory was near. But within the ranks, the mood was less confident, as rumors spread of the Russians preparing to make a stand in the fortified city ahead. In early August, the French vanguard began to encounter more determined Russian rearguard actions. Skirmishes at places like Vitebsk suggested that Barclay might be ready to fight, but each time the Russians withdrew after probing engagements, denying Napoleon the full-scale confrontation he craved. This war of movement tested the endurance of both sides, but the Russians had the advantage. They were falling back toward their supply bases, while the French were stretching theirs to the breaking point. Still, Napoleon believed that Smolensk would change everything. The city's walls and historical significance made it an ideal point for the Russians to defend, and if he could take it, the road to Moscow would be open. By mid-August, Barclay and Bagration's armies had finally converged near Smolensk, giving Napoleon the opportunity he had been seeking for nearly 2 months. The Russian High Command debated their next move. Barclay favored continuing the retreat to preserve the army, while others argued that yielding Smolensk without a fight would be a political disaster and a blow to national morale. Under mounting pressure, Barclay agreed to defend the city, at least long enough to inflict losses on the French and slow their advance. Napoleon, sensing that his chance had come, began massing his forces for a concentrated assault. The approach to Smolensk was marked by increasing resistance as Russian rearguards fought fierce delaying actions in the surrounding villages and along the Dnieper crossings. French troops, weary from weeks of marching and desperate for a decisive victory to justify their sacrifices, prepared for what they hoped would be the turning point of the campaign. The stage was thus set for the Battle of Smolensk, a clash that would reveal much about the strengths and weaknesses of both armies and foreshadow the brutal months ahead. For Napoleon, the capture of the city would signal to Europe that his power remained unshaken. For the Russians, holding or at least contesting Smolensk would demonstrate their resolve and perhaps buy time for reinforcements. In the sweltering heat of August 1812, with the Dnieper flowing sluggishly beneath its walls and the scorched countryside stretching in all directions, two colossal armies prepared to face each other at last. The weeks of pursuit, the hunger, the sickness, and the endless miles of barren road had brought them to this point. But neither Napoleon nor Barclay could yet foresee that. Smolensk, while bloody and destructive, would prove only another step in a campaign hurtling toward catastrophe. The mid-August heat of 1812 hung heavy over the Niemen River as Napoleon's vast Grande Armée approached Smolensk, its soldiers gaunt from weeks of marching, their uniforms stained with dust and sweat, their bellies often empty, yet their spirits sharpened by the long anticipation of a decisive clash. Here, at last, they believed the Russians would stand and fight. Smolensk, with its ancient stone walls dating back to medieval times, its onion-domed churches, and its strategic position commanding the crossings of the Dnieper, was more than just a military target. It was a symbol, a gateway to the heart of Russia. Napoleon understood both the strategic and psychological value of capturing the city. If he could take Smolensk, he could force Tsar Alexander to negotiate or at least compel the Russian army to engage in a battle that would break their capacity to resist. On August 16, 1812, the French vanguard clashed with Russian forward elements outside the city, the opening shots of what would become a brutal 2-day struggle. The Russians, under General Barclay de Tolly and Prince Bagration, had finally concentrated their forces, roughly 120,000 men with substantial artillery, to hold Smolensk, while Napoleon had more than 180,000 troops within striking distance. The battle began with fierce fighting along the approaches, as French forces sought to envelop the city from the north and south, cutting off Russian retreat routes. Marshal Davout's corps attacked from the south, while Marshal Ney and Prince Eugene moved from the north, their infantry advancing under heavy Russian artillery fire. The defenders, taking advantage of the city's stout walls and fortified gates, poured musket and cannon fire into the attackers, repulsing repeated assaults with stubborn determination. The French artillery, brought up in massed batteries, began pounding Smolensk with a relentless barrage, sending masonry crashing into the streets, setting buildings ablaze, and filling the air with choking smoke. For hours, the thunder of guns echoed across the Dnieper, mingled with the cries of the wounded and the clash of bayonets in the outer suburbs. Despite the bombardment, Russian resistance remained fierce. Counterattacks erupted along the northern ramparts, and Bagration's troops in particular fought tenaciously to hold the southern approaches. Napoleon, surveying the battlefield from a vantage point, ordered repeated assaults in hopes of breaking through before nightfall, but the fortified nature of the city and the skill of the defenders made progress slow and costly. The first day ended with much of Smolensk still in Russian hands, its skyline now dominated by pillars of smoke from the fires that raged unchecked through its wooden neighborhoods. On August 17th, Napoleon renewed the assault, committing more troops and concentrating his artillery fire on key gates and bastions. The French managed to force their way into some of the outer districts, engaging in brutal house-to-house fighting as the defenders fell back toward the inner defenses. Flames consumed whole quarters of the city, and the heat from the inferno combined with the summer sun to make the battlefield almost unbearable. Civilians, trapped amidst the chaos, fled in panic across the Dnieper or hid in cellars, many perishing in the flames. By midday, it became clear to Barclay that Smolensk could not be held without risking the destruction of the army. In keeping with the overarching Russian strategy of preservation, he ordered a withdrawal under cover of darkness, leaving a rearguard to delay the French while the main body slipped east toward Moscow. When French troops entered the heart of Smolensk on the morning of August 18th, they found a city reduced to ruins, its streets choked with rubble and the charred remains of buildings. Napoleon declared the Battle of Victory, and indeed, he had taken the city, but it was a hollow triumph. The Russian army had escaped largely intact, retreating to fight another day, and the capture of Smolensk had cost the Grande Armée tens of thousands of casualties, both from combat and the relentless attrition of disease and exhaustion. Napoleon lingered in Smolensk for several days, reorganizing his forces, tending to the wounded, and replenishing supplies as best he could from what little remained in the devastated city. He had hoped that the fall of Smolensk would compel Alexander to sue for peace, but no such offer came. Instead, the Russians continued their withdrawal, now under growing pressure from public opinion, and the Tsar himself to make a stand before surrendering Moscow without a fight. Napoleon faced a critical choice: halt the campaign for the year and consolidate his gains, or continue the advance toward Moscow in hopes of delivering the decisive blow that had eluded him. True to his aggressive nature, he chose to press on. The pursuit resumed in late August, with the French army streaming east along the road to Moscow, harassed constantly by Cossacks and light cavalry who struck at foraging parties, supply convoys, and isolated units before vanishing into the countryside. The weather, which had been punishingly hot in July and early August, began to shift toward cooler, wetter conditions, turning the roads into quagmires and slowing the march. Supply shortages, already severe, became critical. Men marched hungry for days at a time, surviving on whatever they could seize from the land, which was increasingly barren due to the Russians' scorched earth tactics. In early September, with Moscow now only a few weeks' march away, Napoleon finally got what he had been seeking since crossing the Niemen: the promise of a decisive battle. The Russian High Command, recognizing the political impossibility of abandoning Moscow without a fight, replaced Barclay de Tolly with the venerable General Mikhail Kutuzov, a man widely respected by the troops and the Russian people. Kutuzov understood the necessity of confronting Napoleon, but he was determined to do so in a way that maximized Russian advantages and minimized their vulnerabilities. He selected a defensive position near the village of Borodino, about 70 miles west of Moscow, where the terrain offered strong natural and man-made defensive features. The site was anchored by the Kalaka River, with rolling hills, ravines, and a series of redoubts and earthworks constructed to strengthen the line. Kutuzov's plan was to absorb the French attack, inflict maximum casualties, and then, if necessary, withdraw the army intact to preserve its fighting strength. Napoleon, upon learning of the Russian stand at Borodino, began concentrating his forces for the confrontation. He saw this as the long-awaited chance to destroy the Russian army in a single blow, opening the road to Moscow and perhaps ending the war. His own army, however, was no longer the immense force that had crossed the Niemen 2.5 months earlier. Attrition had reduced the Grande Armée to roughly 130,000 combat-effective troops, with thousands more straggling behind or incapacitated by illness. The soldiers who remained were hardened by the march, but worn down by hunger, fatigue, and the unrelenting grind of the campaign. Still, their morale rose at the prospect of finally bringing the Russians to battle. The frustration of endless pursuit and skirmishing would at last be replaced by the clarity of open combat. The days before Borodino were marked by intense preparations on both sides. The Russians fortified their positions, digging trenches, building redoubts, and emplacing artillery batteries. Kutuzov deployed his forces in depth, with strong reserves ready to respond to French breakthroughs. The French, for their part, brought up their own heavy guns and organized their corps for a coordinated assault, though Napoleon's exact plan was less about subtle maneuver and more about overwhelming the enemy through sheer force. On the eve of battle, the two armies faced each other across a narrow front, their camps lit by countless campfires under the clear September sky. For many soldiers, the night was restless. Letters were written, prayers were said, and quiet conversations passed between comrades who knew that tomorrow might be their last day. Napoleon, confident but aware of the stakes, told his marshals that the coming battle would be the most terrible of all, but also the key to the campaign. Kutuzov, too, addressed his men, invoking the defense of the motherland and the sanctity of Moscow to inspire them for the struggle ahead. Thus, in the quiet hours before dawn, on September 7, 1812, the stage was set for Borodino, a battle that would prove to be one of the bloodiest single days in the history of warfare. A clash of wills and armies on a scale that Europe had rarely seen, and one whose outcome, though indecisive in immediate terms, would tip the balance of the entire campaign. The Grande Armée, reduced but still formidable, prepared to hurl itself against the entrenched Russian positions, while the Russian army, resolute and disciplined, stood ready to bleed the invader and buy time for the defense of Moscow. Both Napoleon and Kutuzov knew that what happened on this field would echo far beyond the dusty plain of Borodino, shaping not only the fate of Moscow, but the future of the Napoleonic Wars themselves. The morning of September 7, 1812, broke under a pale, misty sky over the rolling fields near the village of Borodino, where two colossal armies faced one another in grim anticipation, each prepared for a clash that would decide the fate of Moscow and perhaps the entire campaign. To the west, Napoleon's Grande Armée, reduced to around 130,000 effective combat troops, but supported by nearly 600 guns, stretched across the plains in disciplined lines, while to the east, General Mikhail Kutuzov's Russian army, numbering roughly 120,000 men with over 600 artillery pieces, occupied a formidable defensive position anchored by the Kalaka River and reinforced by fieldworks, redoubts, and the distinctive earth fortifications known as the Bagratian Fletches and the Great Redoubt. The air was tense and eerily quiet in the moments before the first guns opened fire, yet beneath the silence lay a palpable sense of destiny. Napoleon, who had fought and won dozens of battles across Europe, believed that Borodino would be his crowning tactical masterpiece, the decisive hammer blow that would break Russian resistance and open the road to Moscow. While Kutuzov, old and cautious, but deeply attuned to the national spirit, understood that his role was not necessarily to win outright, but to blooding Napoleon's army so severely that the French advance would be fatally weakened. At around 6 a.m., the French artillery roared to life, unleashing a deafening barrage that tore into the Russian lines, shattering earthworks, felling men and horses, and filling the air with choking smoke. The Russians responded in kind, and soon the entire battlefield trembled under the thunder of hundreds of guns firing in unison, their reports echoing across the countryside like rolling thunderclaps of doom. Napoleon's plan was straightforward, but brutally ambitious. Smash the Russian left at the Bagration Fletches, then roll up the enemy line toward the center, eventually capturing the Great Redoubt and breaking the Russian army in two. Marshal Davout's the First Corps, supported by Ney's the Third Corps and Prince Eugene's the Fourth Corps, spearheaded the assault on the Fletches, while Poniatowski's Polish Corps pressed against the Russian right to pin it down. The fighting for the Bagration Fletches quickly became some of the most savage of the Napoleonic era. French columns advanced through a hail of grapeshot and musket fire, storming the earthen fortifications only to be driven out again by desperate Russian counterattacks. The ground changed hands multiple times in the course of a few hours, with each exchange leaving the field littered with bodies. The Russian commander on that sector, Prince Pyotr Bagration, inspired his men with personal bravery, riding among the troops and urging them to stand firm. However, in the midst of one of the fiercest assaults, he was struck by a cannonball that shattered his leg, a wound that would later prove fatal. His removal from the field was a severe blow to Russian morale, yet the troops continued to resist with ferocious determination, buying precious time and inflicting appalling casualties on the French. Meanwhile, to the north, Eugene's forces engaged in a bloody struggle for the Great Redoubt, a massive earthwork bristling with Russian artillery. Initial assaults were repelled with devastating losses, as French infantry and cavalry were cut down by point-blank cannon fire. Napoleon, observing from a central position near the Shevardino Redoubt, refused to commit his Imperial Guard, preferring to hold them in reserve for the decisive blow that he was certain would come once the Russian line began to crumble. This caution, perhaps uncharacteristic for the normally aggressive emperor, has been debated by historians ever since. Some argue that committing the Guard earlier might have secured a decisive victory, while others contend that their use would have been premature and possibly wasteful given the depth of Russian defenses. The day wore on in a grinding, attritional struggle, with neither side able to deliver a knockout blow. By mid-afternoon, the French finally captured the Bagration Fletches for good, driving the Russians back toward their second line of defense, but at an enormous cost in lives. In the center, repeated French attacks on the Great Redoubt culminated in a massive cavalry charge by General Caulaincourt, whose horsemen stormed the fortifications in a whirlwind of sabers and lances, cutting down the Russian gunners and seizing the position. Caulaincourt himself was killed in the assault, falling among his men in the heat of victory. By evening, the battlefield was a vision of hell. Tens of thousands of dead and wounded lay scattered across the blood-soaked fields, the air thick with the stench of powder and death. Official casualty estimates vary, but the French suffered around 30,000 killed or wounded, while the Russians lost perhaps 40,000, including many officers. Yet despite these horrific losses, the Russian army had not been destroyed. Kutuzov, recognizing the futility of holding his position against further French attacks, ordered a withdrawal during the night, preserving the bulk of his forces for the defense of Moscow. Napoleon, exhausted and perhaps mindful of the toll the day had taken on his army, chose not to pursue immediately. Borodino was technically a French victory. The Russians had retreated, leaving the field in French hands, but it was a victory so costly and indecisive that it might as well have been a stalemate. The Grande Armée, already diminished before Borodino, had been bled white. The soldiers who remained were battle-hardened, but physically worn, and the losses among experienced officers and cavalry mounts further weakened the army's operational strength. In the days following Borodino, Napoleon resumed the march toward Moscow, his progress slowed by the need to tend to the wounded and repair the battered formations. The road to Moscow was littered with signs of the Russian retreat: abandoned wagons, burned villages, and fields stripped bare. The French soldiers, though buoyed by the belief that they were on the verge of a final triumph, marched in increasing hardship, subsisting on dwindling rations and whatever could be scavenged. On September 14th, Napoleon and his advance guard crested the Poklonnaya hill, and there, spread before them in the distance, lay Moscow, the fabled heart of Russia, its golden domes and sprawling skyline shimmering in the autumn sunlight. Expecting to be met by envoys offering surrender, Napoleon was astonished to find the city eerily silent. As the French entered Moscow, they discovered that most of the population had fled. The streets were deserted, and the once bustling markets stood empty. The few inhabitants who remained were largely the poor, foreign merchants, or those unable to leave. Napoleon established his headquarters in the Kremlin, awaiting the arrival of Russian envoys and assuming that Alexander would soon sue for peace now that Moscow was in French hands. But within hours of the French occupation, fires began to break out across the city. At first, they were small and scattered, but soon they spread with terrifying speed, driven by strong winds and feeding on the city's predominantly wooden structures. It became clear that the fires were no accident. Russian authorities, under the direction of Governor Rostopchin, had deliberately set the city ablaze to deny the French shelter and supplies. Over the next several days, the inferno consumed large swaths of Moscow, reducing much of it to smoldering ruins. French soldiers fought to extinguish the flames, forming bucket lines and tearing down buildings to create fire breaks, but the conflagration was beyond control. Napoleon, standing in the Kremlin surrounded by walls that glowed red in the night from the reflection of the flames, watched in disbelief as the prize he had marched thousands of miles to seize was destroyed before his eyes. The burning of Moscow was a psychological as well as a logistical catastrophe for Napoleon. Instead of a functioning capital from which to dictate peace terms and resupply his army, he found himself in possession of a ruin, stripped of food, fodder, and shelter. The loss of winter quarters in a city that could no longer sustain his troops posed a grave dilemma. For weeks, Napoleon lingered in Moscow, sending letters to Alexander proposing negotiations, but the Tsar refused even to respond, determined to drag out the campaign and allow the Russian winter to finish what Borodino had begun. The French army, idle and poorly supplied, began to suffer from cold nights, hunger, and mounting sickness. Foraging parties ventured further and further from the city, often falling prey to Cossack ambushes. Discipline eroded, morale sagged. What had seemed like the verge of ultimate victory was, in reality, the beginning of the Grande Armée's slow unraveling. The decision of whether to advance further, remain in the devastated city, or retreat before winter closed in would become one of the most fateful choices of Napoleon's career, and the wrong decision could doom his entire army. By the early days of October 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte found himself in a position unlike any he had faced before: the Grande Armée. Once the most formidable military force in Europe, was camped in the smoldering ruins of Moscow, a city that had promised victory but delivered only ash, deprivation, and uncertainty. The fires that Governor Rostopchin's men had set in September had destroyed nearly 3/4 of the Russian capital, along with its food stores, its stables, and its capacity to serve as a base for winter quarters, and the hoped-for peace overtures from Tsar Alexander had never arrived. Napoleon, ever the strategist, weighed his options. To remain in Moscow until spring would mean starvation for his men and the risk of being trapped by the Russian winter, while to march further east towards St. Petersburg or deeper into Russia would stretch his already thin supply lines to the breaking point and court disaster. The third option, retreat, was the most unpalatable to a man whose career had been defined by relentless offensive action. Yet the harsh truth was becoming undeniable. The Grande Armée could not survive the winter in Moscow, and the Tsar's refusal to negotiate meant that the campaign's strategic objectives were already lost. Still, Napoleon hesitated, partly from pride, partly from a gambler's instinct that fortune might yet turn. He lingered until mid-October, issuing orders, reshuffling units, and sending dispatches that betrayed neither the depth of his army's plight nor the anxiety that gnawed at him. Finally, on October 19, 1812, the order was given. The French would leave Moscow and begin the long march west toward Smolensk, retracing the route by which they had come, though now the path would be choked with the debris of war, harried by Russian cavalry, and increasingly plagued by the onset of winter. The army that set out from Moscow numbered around 100,000 combat troops, but this figure masked the reality of its condition. Tens of thousands more were stragglers wounded or camp followers, wives, children, merchants, and servants, all of whom slowed the march and consumed precious supplies. Horses were already dying for lack of fodder, forcing the abandonment of artillery pieces and wagons that could no longer be hauled. The first weeks of the retreat were marked by miserable weather, cold rain that turned the roads into quagmires, soaking the soldiers and chilling them to the bone. Foraging parties found little to bring back, as the Russians had pursued a scorched earth policy along the retreat route, just as they had during the French advance. More ominously, Cossack raiders began to appear on the flanks, their hit-and-run tactics picking off stragglers, capturing supply wagons, and forcing the French to divert troops to protect the columns. Still, the weather in late October was survivable, and morale, though low, had not yet collapsed entirely. Many soldiers clung to the belief that if they could reach Smolensk, they would find depots of food and ammunition prepared earlier in the campaign. That fragile hope began to unravel with the Battle of Maloy-Yaroslavets on October 24th, when Napoleon's attempt to take a southern route through Kaluga, which promised richer lands and better supplies, was blocked by Kutuzov's army. The ensuing battle was fierce and bloody, with control of the town changing hands multiple times in a single day. Though the French ultimately took Maloy-Yaroslavets, the cost was high, and Kutuzov's forces remained unbroken, barring the way south. Faced with the prospect of another pitched battle and unwilling to risk further heavy losses, Napoleon abandoned the Kaluga road and turned back onto the very same ravaged Smolensk road he had taken in the summer, a decision that would prove catastrophic, as it condemned his army to retrace its path through a wasteland already stripped of food and shelter. By early November, the weather turned sharply colder. Temperatures plunged well below freezing, and the first heavy snowfalls blanketed the countryside. The French, already poorly clothed and many without proper winter gear, began to succumb to frostbite, exhaustion, and disease. Boots wore through, uniforms stiffened into icy armor, and soldiers huddled at night around inadequate fires, their breath hanging in the air like ghosts of the men they had once been. The retreat rapidly devolved into a nightmare. Each day's march was measured not by distance, but by survival. Soldiers stumbled forward in ragged columns, their ranks thinning with each passing hour. Starvation became as deadly an enemy as the Russians. Men boiled leather from their packs and belts into a foul soup, gnawed on horseflesh when an animal dropped in the traces, and scavenged frozen turnips from abandoned fields. Discipline eroded. Units dissolved into mobs, and desertion was rampant, though the vastness of the Russian countryside left little hope for those who tried to flee. The Cossacks and partisan bands struck constantly, their sudden attacks sowing panic and further scattering the columns. French cavalry, once the terror of Europe, was reduced to a pitiful remnant as horses died in droves. Many cavalrymen fought on foot or were absorbed into infantry units. The artillery arms suffered equally. Without horses to draw them, guns were abandoned in the snow, left to be captured or destroyed by the pursuing Russians. By the time the remnants of the Grande Armée reached Smolensk in mid-November, the army was a shadow of its former self. Smolensk, which Napoleon had envisioned as a salvation, proved to be little more than a temporary reprieve. The supply depots were inadequate to feed the tens of thousands who poured into the city, and the chaos of distribution left many hungry or empty-handed. Napoleon ordered the retreat to continue almost immediately, aware that the Russians were closing in and that to remain stationary would invite encirclement. The next stage of the retreat would bring the army face to face with one of the most infamous ordeals in military history, the crossing of the Berezina River. But before reaching that desperate moment, the French would suffer the full wrath of the Russian winter. The temperature continued to plummet as the army pressed westward. Eyewitnesses described men freezing to death where they stood, their bodies locked in the poses of life, still clutching muskets or the reins of dead horses. Frostbite turned hands and feet black. Those afflicted often had to be left behind, as there was no means to carry them. Snowstorms blinded the columns and buried the road, making progress painfully slow. At night, the moans of the dying mixed with the howling of wolves that trailed the army, scavenging the dead. The Russians under Kutuzov, along with separate detachments led by generals like Miloradovich, harried the retreat relentlessly, launching sudden attacks on weakened units and forcing Napoleon to fight a series of rearguard actions just to keep his army moving. By late November, the survivors approached the Berezina River near Borisov, only to find that the Russians had destroyed the bridges and that large enemy forces were converging on both banks. The situation was dire. On one side, the exhausted French army, reduced to perhaps 40,000 combat-capable troops and tens of thousands of stragglers. On the other, Russian armies seeking to trap and annihilate them. In one of the most remarkable feats of engineering under fire Napoleon's pontooniers, led by General Jean-Baptiste Ebel, constructed makeshift bridges out of whatever materials could be found, often standing waist-deep in the icy water as they worked. From November 26th to 29th, the French fought their way across the river in a chaotic, desperate operation. The crossings were scenes of unimaginable horror. Wagons overturned into the water, men and horses drowned in the icy current, and the river choked with the bodies of those who could not make it to the far bank. Russian artillery pounded the crossing points, and rearguard units fought ferociously to hold the enemy at bay. Yet against all odds, Napoleon succeeded in getting the core of his army across, though at a terrible cost, perhaps 20,000 more lives lost in those few days alone. The retreat did not end at the Berezina. The survivors, many now little more than skeletons wrapped in rags, trudged onward through snow and ice, driven by the single thought of reaching safety beyond the Niemen River. By mid-December 1812, the remnants of the once Grand Army crossed back into friendly territory. Of the more than 600,000 men who had begun the campaign, only around 100,000, and of those, perhaps fewer than 30,000 combat-ready soldiers, returned. The rest were dead, captured, or scattered in the vastness of Russia. The loss was staggering not only in human terms, but in its strategic consequences. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded Napoleon was shattered, and the enemies of France, emboldened by the disaster, would soon unite in the Sixth Coalition to drive him from power. Napoleon himself returned to Paris ahead of his army, arriving in December to reassure the French people and the political establishment that the empire was secure. Even as the truth was plain, the invasion of Russia had been a catastrophic blunder, one that had destroyed the Grande Armée and marked the beginning of the end for his reign. The retreat from Moscow was more than a military defeat. It was a human tragedy on a scale rarely seen in history. The men who had marched east in the summer of 1812, confident in their emperor and the strength of their arms, had faced not only the skill of the Russian army, but the implacable forces of nature, the vastness of the Russian landscape, and the then scorched earth tactics that denied them sustenance. The images left by survivors, frozen corpses along the road, men reduced to eating horseflesh or worse, the endless white wastes stretching to the horizon, became symbols of hubris and the limits of imperial ambition. Napoleon's genius as a commander had brought him countless victories, but in Russia, his strategic overreach, his underestimation of his opponent's resolve, and his disregard for the logistical realities of such a vast campaign had combined to produce a disaster that no amount of personal courage or tactical brilliance could reverse. As 1813 dawned, Europe would never again see Napoleon at the head of an army so vast or so confident. The Grande Armée was gone, and with it, the certainty that Napoleon could bend the continent to his will. The road from Moscow to the Niemen had been paved with frozen bodies and broken dreams, and its legacy would haunt not only the soldiers who survived, but the man who had led them there, as the shadow of Russia stretched over the remainder of his reign.